Welcome, everybody, to our webinar today, Presidential Leadership in Times of Crisis. I'm Jeff Sikkenga, Executive Director of the Ashbrook Center at Ashland University. Thank you all for coming. So many folks have joining us from around the country. We're delighted that you're here today to spend some time with us thinking about this really important topic, a topic that's so important for today, and a topic that's been undoubtedly important in American history. So I want to welcome you and thank you for coming. This is the second webinar in our Insights from History series, sponsored by the Ashbrook Center and teachingamericanhistory.org, which is a project of the Ashbrook Center. We're offering this webinar series as part of our mission at the Ashbrook Center and at Teaching American History to strengthen constitutional self-government. That's our mission, and we do it by educating our fellow Americans in the history and principles of this country. And we have outreach programs to students, to teachers, and to citizens. And this webinar series is part of that outreach and that education. So again, thank you for joining us. We're going to be having a conversation today, and this conversation is reflective of the Ashbrook way of teaching and learning. As you know from the links that you all were sent, we have a large resource of primary source historical documents in American history and government, and the Ashbrook way of teaching and learning is rooted in the study of those primary historical documents and rooted in thinking, in conversation about the great questions that arise out of those documents, the great questions that animate the American story. So we're going to have a conversation today and delve into some of those documents on this really important and timely topic of presidential leadership in times of crisis. And our hope is today that we can learn from history, that we can discover for ourselves some historical perspective that allows us to reflect on our current situation and perhaps gain some insights that allow us to think more clearly about the situation and hopefully even act more wisely. That's our goal today. As I said, thank you for joining us so much. This will be recorded for everyone's benefit in case you want to go back and listen to it again, watch it again, or if you want to send it to your friends, your family, your children, your grandchildren. We will make that available to you after the session. You'll be sent an email with the recording link as well. So please do share that. There are so many hundreds of you joining us from around the country that we hope that this can get out in the hands of many, even more folks from around the country for their benefit as well. We're going to be having this conversation today. I am with Professor Steve Knott. Dr. Knott is the Thomas and Mabel Guy Professor of American History and Government in Ashbrook's Masters of American History and Government program. He's also Professor of National Security Affairs at the United States Naval War College in Newport, Rhode Island. Before that, Dr. Knott was co-chair of the Oral History Project of the Presidency at the Miller Center at University of Virginia. And before that, he was associate professor at the United States Air Force Academy. So a long and distinguished academic career. Professor Knott received his Bachelor of Arts from Assumption College and his PhD from Boston College. He is a New Englander born and bred and the author of many books, a real expert on the history of the American presidency. Just a few of the books, really great ones. I've read them. They are insightful, illuminating, and always well read. They are a couple of titles: Secret and Sanctioned, Covert Operations in the American Presidency, Washington and Hamilton, The Alliance That Forged America, and his most recent book, a really wonderful study of the American presidency called The Lost Soul of the American Presidency. And in the book, he offers a contrast between the founder's vision for the American president and the presidency as it has developed and as we have it today in the United States. Let me recommend it to you very highly. I know it's for sale on Amazon and other retailers. We can get these shipped right to your home today. Make some great reading. Again, it's called The Lost Soul of the American Presidency. Let me recommend it very highly. Dr. Knott also has the interesting distinction of having been a scholarly reference for Ron Chernow, who biography of Alexander Hamilton, as many of you know, was the source for the musical by Lin Manuel Miranda, Hamilton. And in fact, I was talking with Dr. Knott earlier, and I had heard that he in fact had an exchange with Lin Manuel Miranda on some of the historical aspects of the musical. Steve, is that true?
Well, it is true, Jeff, and thank you again for having me. Thank you to the Ashbrook Center. Thanks to the folks at Teaching American History. You guys all do a tremendous job. Yeah, when Ron Chernow was preparing his Hamilton biography, he got in touch with a number of folks who had done some work on Hamilton, and I had happened to have a book on Hamilton that came out in 2001, which was long before it became cool to admire Alexander Hamilton. I just want to put that on the record. And Chernow referred to that book. It's cited quite a bit in his Hamilton biography. He and I communicated via email a few times. He had an occasional question. So I was happy to play some small role in putting that massive Hamilton biography together, which in turn led to the Broadway hit musical. I just wish I'd get a percentage of some of the take from that musical, but life is unfair.
You're stuck gleaning the academic field.
Exactly.
Well, thank you so much for being here with us, Steve. I
Thank
wanted
you.
to start perhaps this discussion of presidential leadership by asking you to take a step back for us and talk a little bit about the presidency as the founders envisioned it in our Constitution, and to say a little bit more about what they thought the role of the president would be. And as you know, one of our readings that you had us look at today was Washington's proclamation about the Whiskey Rebellion early on in the Republic. And I'm wondering if that vision of the founders, as articulated in our Constitution, was it challenged early on by events like that?
I believe it was, Jeff. And we're talking specifically here about the Whiskey Rebellion, where you had an uprising on the frontier in what is now parts of Western Pennsylvania against an excise tax that both Hamilton and Washington had pushed through in 1791. But let me back up a bit just before I dive more into the Whiskey Rebellion. There was a conception of the presidency that I would say most of the founders shared. It's always, you got to be careful about painting with too broad of a brush. But I think that conception that at least Washington shared, Hamilton shared, I would argue James Madison shared, was the role of the president as head of state. That he was not supposed to be somebody who necessarily reflected the will of the majority, but he was supposed to be somebody who takes care that the laws be faithfully executed. And so the conception of the office that the framers had was again rooted in the Constitution, not in necessarily in the votes of a majority. And I'm emphasizing that point because this notion of taking care that the laws be faithfully executed, I think over time has been eroded considerably. And instead, we have a conception of the presidency that truly sees it as the office as the voice of the people. And there are real dangers in that, of course, if you happen to be a member of an ethnic or religious or economic minority who's not in step with the majority. So, arguably, one of the first tests of that framers' conception of the Constitution was the Whiskey Rebellion, which occurs in the summer of 1794. Again, the Washington administration, Hamilton as Secretary of the Treasury, had put in place some excise taxes on liquor. And in parts of the country, alcohol, particularly whiskey, was actually a medium of exchange. It was almost used as a currency. So there was some real pushback against this, again, particularly in parts of Western Pennsylvania, to the point where there was some violent resistance to the revenuers that Hamilton's Treasury Department dispatched to Pennsylvania. And it got to the point where both Washington and Hamilton concluded that this lawlessness was a real test of this new government and a test of the idea that America was a place where the rule of law prevailed rather than an armed minority. And so a large army, I think about 13,000 or so men, recruited from the neighboring states as well as from Pennsylvania, marched into the western part of Pennsylvania for a brief period of time. President Washington was at the head of this march, and then he was replaced by Hamilton. The rebellion quickly dissipated. The tax, in a sense, was ultimately enforced, so there was resistance right up until it was abolished under President Jefferson. But I want to add one quick thing, Jeff. This mixture of Washington's firmness and his commitment to the rule of law was also tempered by what I would call a kind of magnanimous soul that Washington had. He pardoned the ringleaders of the Whiskey Rebellion. Some of them were tried for treason and convicted and could have been executed. And instead, President Washington, exercising that formidable pardon power, used it to spare the lives of some of these ringleaders. And to
Hmm.
me, that mix of firmness and magnanimity is one of the keys to his successful presidency.
That's very interesting. Did Washington think of those folks in Western Pennsylvania as misguided patriots or as traitors? Because one of the documents you had us look at, his proclamation, in the second paragraph, he says, which their actions, he says, which I am advised amount to treason.
Yeah. Yeah, it's a terrific question, Jeff. And I think that's probably a little bit more of Hamilton and less of Washington. Hamilton always took a consistently harder line on this kind of law, what he viewed as lawless defiance. I think he was right. Washington, I think, again, had a more magnanimous or altruistic approach to these folks. Again, and you can see it in his pardons. We're not sure, we can't find evidence of Hamilton's position on whether Washington should pardon these people. It occurs after Hamilton leaves government, so he may not have even been consulted. But to get to your question again, in this entire event, which really spanned from 1791 to 94, in some ways, Hamilton's taking the harder line. I see Washington as a much more magnanimous soul regarding this whole thing. But again, I don't want to make it seem, I mean, he really did believe this was a test of the new government, of the new Constitution, and the principle that we were a people who were going to live under the rule of law was at stake. So he believed in that firmly.
But it also looks like, though, from the proclamation that he tried to um, con- conciliate the folks in Western Pennsylvania. They tried alternative means so that his first response to the crisis was not immediate military action, but some attempt to engage them. Is that right?
That's absolutely right, Jeff. Yeah, there were a number of concessions made from between 1791 and 1794. For instance, at one point, the Treasury Department agreed to buy all of the whiskey for the United States Army, but I shouldn't say all of it, but a high percentage of it from these folks who are being hurt by the excise taxes. That was an attempt to extend a bit of an olive branch. And then there were a series of concessions made over that 3 year period in terms of delaying the enforcement, adjusting the percentages, and so forth. So, from the perspective of President Washington, he and his administration had made a good faith effort to try to reach out and strike some sort of a bargain. His patience broke in the summer of 1794. Hamilton's had actually broken quite a bit early.
Hmm. Washington was famous for being a man of great self control. You talked about his patience there, and well known for sort of developing rules even as a young man of sort of right conduct. One of those is great self control. It's also true, though, that there are reports of times when he did lose his self control, of a kind of volcanic temper and real anger. Was this one of those times?
I, Washington has his critics when it comes to this affair, and there are other books the folks can look at. There's an author by the name of William Hoagland who's written about the Whiskey Rebellion. Takes a very different perspective on this matter than the one I'm telling you this morning or this afternoon. Um, but I don't think this is an example of his volcanic temper at work, which, as you rightly point out, this is a man who writes these 100 rules of civility, I think, as a young teenager, and has to really fight, in a sense, all his life to get a handle on that volcanic temper that people did witness. By the way, Alexander Hamilton witnessed it at one point, and those two briefly split during the Revolutionary War over what Hamilton felt was Washington's mistreatment of Hamilton. But I don't see this as an example of that. I do see Washington, and I'm glad you brought this up. This is a leader who recognized his failings and worked on them. And it was a struggle, a real struggle, I think, for him, particularly in regards to his temperament. And if only more of our leaders had that ability to sort of step out of themselves, analyze their pluses and their minuses, and act accordingly. I think he's one of those rare figures who was able to do that.
And you see that from him early on in his life. I mean, it's amazing to me. I have a teenage son. They're not known for their thoughtful introspection. Is that a product of Washington's own natural temperament, or was that how he was educated? Because of course, what goes into forming a great leader in times of crisis, we see them in times of crisis, but a lot goes into their development up to that point
No
that then
question.
crisis might show us.
No question. Yeah, I'm not sure I have a good answer for you, Jeff, on that, except that clearly, as a fairly young man, he is already thinking about how one should act appropriately in a civilized society. That is, as you mentioned, a unique concept, I think, for most teenagers. Where that comes from, there might be some folks out there that have a better sense of that than I. I will say this is a man who was constantly testing himself. He could have lived a life of comfort. He was, essentially part of the Virginia gentry. Not that he didn't have setbacks in his life. He did. His father died at a relatively young age. And he had other setbacks, but he was constantly testing himself. And I think those tests, surveying the frontier, being one of the first Virginians to head deep and deep into the frontier, both before the French and Indian War and during it, and then, of course, assuming command of the Continental Army, which was an incredible roll of the dice. He could have easily been killed on a number of occasions. There are endless accounts of horses being shot out from under George Washington during the French and Indian War, brushes with death during the American Revolution. He's constantly testing himself, and I think he's using these tests as a way of improving his character. And again, God bless him. I wish we all had that ability to continue to learn, even as we get into our 60s, in my case.
Right.
That might have been too much information.
Well, we had actually raised a question that one of our participants has sent in on Washington's. How much did it matter that Washington had served in the military and, as you said, was commander of the Continental Army, so that when he faces a crisis like this as president, does that give him insight or abilities that he might not have had he not had that military experience?
Terrific question. I think one possible lesson that both Washington and Hamilton, who was at Washington's side throughout the Revolutionary War, a good part of that war, one thing they learned was if you are going to use military force, either in a battle, a war combat situation, or perhaps even putting down a domestic insurrection, you got to do it with some firmness. There is a point where the kind of conciliatory gestures have to end, and Washington reached that point in the summer of 1794. I do think there's probably a lesson there that he learned from his military experience, that if you wish to triumph in a struggle involving armed force, you got to bring everything you got to bear on it. The other thing I would say about Washington and his wartime experience that shapes his view of his role as the nation's first president is he had traveled this country from its southern frontiers, in a sense, all the way up into New England. And he really develops a sense of American nationhood. He becomes an American first and a Virginian second. That takes a little while, but it's partly, or I would say almost entirely, due to his role in the Revolutionary War, where he develops a sense of American nationalism. And he is determined to leave this country and this new constitution intact for his successors. And so that also plays a role in his thinking about what he sees as a lawless insurrection, defying the will of a constitutional process. These excise taxes were passed by the House, passed by the Senate, signed into law by the president. And here you've got a test of an armed resistance to, in a sense, this due process that had occurred. He was not going to let that pass.
And he saw this, as you were just saying, not just as a kind of skirmish on the frontiers of the new America. Western Pennsylvania in those days was pretty far out, right? From
Yes.
out to the west. But tell us a little bit more. Why did he think of this as such an existential threat to the country, as opposed to just a rabble of backwoodsmen, new immigrants, barely even Americans by some accounts from his own generals? Why did he see this as such a serious threat that, in fact, if I'm not mistaken, he, as you said, he rode out with the troops
For a brief
uh,
period.
and may have been the last president to do that?
I think James Madison did it briefly in the War of 1812 at the Battle of Bladensburg and ends up running back to Washington for his life, to the city of Washington. But yes, point taken. Again, if you put yourself in Washington's position, the United States government is 5 years old or so at this point in 1794. If you trace it back to the Constitutional Convention, we're 7 years old. But point is, it was not clear that this was going to work out. It was not clear that our experiment in ordered liberty was going to survive. And if there was one thing that he was determined to, as I said, leave not just his presidential successors, but future generations of Americans, he wanted to make sure that all of the sacrifices that he had made and his soldiers had made in that revolution were not going to be lost in the peacetime. And that may have, you could argue that maybe that distorted his impression of the events on the distant frontier. Thomas Jefferson certainly felt that way. He felt that this was much ado about nothing. And in fact, he called the Whiskey Rebellion Hamilton's insurrection. Uh, Washington, interestingly, named the militia force that marched to put the rebels down the Army of the Constitution. So, in his view, he was preserving and protecting the Constitution as his presidential oath was, required him to do.
Mhm.
I'm willing to grant they may have made too much out of this, but it's very easy to sit here 230 plus years later and engage in that kind of, second guessing from centuries removed. It was a big deal for Washington and
Mhm.
Hamilton.
And did it have an effect? One of the things we think about when we talk about presidential leadership in times of crisis is sometimes it can have a beneficial effect if the president acts decisively and effectively in a time of crisis. And sometimes, of course, mishandling a crisis or overreacting can cost presidents their presidency and
Sure.
certainly their popularity. We had a question from one of our participants. What effect did this have on Washington, the rest of Washington's presidency?
Yeah, another terrific question. It was all seen as part of a piece, part of the same thread by Washington's opponents, who at this point are pretty much out in public, and that would include former Secretary of State Jefferson, James Madison, and the Democrat Republican Party that is just starting to form. They saw the suppression of the Whiskey Rebellion in concert with the issuance of the Neutrality Proclamation, which seemed, in the view of Jeffersonians, to tilt the United States towards Great Britain and away from France. They saw Hamilton's National Bank. They saw Hamilton's assumption plans, all of which passed with Washington's approval. Um, they saw all of this as part of a thread where Washington, in their view, was betraying the spirit of 1776. And this is definitely going to cost Washington, politically speaking, and going to add to this perception on the part of the Jeffersonians, that Washington was a puppet of Hamilton, or perhaps even worse, that Washington actually agreed with Hamilton. And so you really do begin to see in 1794, 95, the opposition press beginning to question Washington's patriotism. It's kind of remarkable. And the Whiskey Rebellion is part of that questioning.
All right. So you're saying even George Washington, in responding to this crisis, gets what we would call now negative press
Absolutely.
And how did he feel about that? All presidents seem to get it. All of them think the press is treating them unfairly. How did Washington react to that?
He was deeply disturbed by it, particularly by, as you can imagine, the questioning of his patriotism. If there was anyone you would have thought would be sort of bulletproof on that front, you would think it would be George Washington. But by 1795, with the Jay Treaty, which again seems to tilt us even more in the direction of a pro-British foreign policy, there is simply outright questioning of this man's patriotism. Even Thomas Jefferson seems to suggest in what he thought was a private letter, which then goes public, that George Washington had, pardon the expression, become a whore for Great Britain. It was
That's
ugly
strong
stuff.
language.
That's yes, it is. It is. It was ugly stuff. It bothered Washington to no end, but he kept his hurt, and he was deeply hurt. He kept it under wraps for the most part. Only a few people witnessed this. He did not lash out at his opponents. And that goes back to that conception of the presidency as the head of state, as an office that needs to be conducted with a certain amount of dignity, restraint, silence, silence about issues that are beneath you in a sense. He followed that model as much as those attacks stung, and they really stung.
That raises, to my mind, the interesting question and comparison with another one of the readings you had, which was David Frost's interview with Richard Nixon.
Yeah,
Nixon, not necessarily known as a president for his magnanimity, his greatness of spirit, his willingness to let criticism go. Um, but Nixon articulates there in that interview a similar notion that the American Republic is under threat. And I wonder, of course, by this time, it's much more deeply established. By 1970, in the interview is in 1977. By that time, it's much more deeply established than in 1794 and presumably more secure, but that's not necessarily how Richard Nixon sees it. Could you just compare and contrast Nixon's response to that kind of dissent with Washington's?
sure. Yeah, Richard Nixon, as you said, Jeff, I mean, he's not known for his magnanimity. American politics in the 20th century, the sort of partisan friction, the personal attacks, become part and parcel of our political life, and presidents are expected, certainly presidential candidates are almost expected to engage in it. So I don't mean to necessarily single out poor Richard Nixon, who seems to be sort of the poster boy for presidential misbehavior. There are plenty of other folks I could have chosen. Um, and look, Nixon's argument that there are situations where the president may have to act where the law is silent, and in some even extreme cases, act against the law out of necessity, is a doctrine that people as varied as Thomas Jefferson and Abraham Lincoln endorsed. But what I was hoping to get at more with Nixon was the importance of character, the importance of we all of us as voters putting emphasis on these character questions. Is this a person that seems to have that sort of presidential temperament, the temperament that a Washington and a Lincoln possessed, that sense of magnanimity, that unwillingness to target opponents as enemies? And Nixon, of course, had his famous enemies list. Again, he's not the only modern president to have something similar to that. Um, but I do think Nixon sometimes mistook the office for himself. Um, I think one of the older conception of the office is there needs to be a high wall of separation between the individual who's passing through the office and the office itself. And that gets blurred, I think, with a lot of our 20th century presidents who are not really following the founder's conception of the presidency. They're following a progressive conception. And so, because we've lowered that wall, um, between the individual who briefly possesses the office and the office itself, I think the American political order has been damaged by it. Nixon's just one of many that I could have cited who have contributed to that damage.
And and you say that's in your mind in part because we have a sense that the person is the office. rather than
That's
that
right.
they occupy the office.
That's
And
right.
sometimes you hear popular conception of that. People will say, well, the president's the leader of the country.
Yeah,
Is that a constitutional idea? It's certainly something you'd see Nixon referring to here.
right. Look, in the sense that the founders believed that the president was the head of state, that's accurate. However, what has to go with that is this sense of restraint. Is a sense of limits about the office, a sense of limits about the potentialities of politics and government. If you remove those limits, then we're off in dangerous territory. And so while I accept the idea of the president as a head of state, again, the earlier conception was that comes with certain responsibilities, certain obligations, one of which is, some of which are, to act in a dignified manner, to not be engaged in attacking domestic opponents and accusing them of treason, um, to play that unifying figure, to appeal to the better angels of our nature, as Lincoln referred to. Lincoln's an interesting case study. If there's any president who had a right to want to take it out on his opponents, it's Lincoln. And yet he rarely, in terms of talking about Jefferson Davis or the Confederacy, or this is not a man engaging in personal attacks. This is a man reluctant to use the term treason. This is a man who continues to refer to the Confederates as our fellow Americans. This is a man who says we all worship the same God and read the same Bible. That's the kind of magnanimity I'm talking about. And it also is a recognition of the limits of the role of the president.
And you mentioned those limits have in some ways um, been expanded or even gotten rid of with a new conception of the presidency that someone like Richard Nixon was operating in. And I know with your studies now of John F. Kennedy, probably Kennedy as well was
Yes,
operating in, and maybe even presidents who we would normally call politically conservative, like George W. Bush, still
yeah,
have a similar view of the presidency. Could you say a little bit more about that change in the conception of the presidency? Because that seems
sure.
to be really important to this question of what a president should do in times of crisis.
Yeah, great question, Jeff. So what happens, a lot of the folks in the Ashbrook program and in the Teaching American History program will have heard this before, but it's true. The progressive era, Teddy Roosevelt in particular, Woodrow Wilson, especially in terms of providing a kind of theological and philosophical endorsement of an activist presidency that's, to be blunt, contemptuous of constitutional restraints. Wilson believed that the Constitution was all fine and dandy for the 1780s, but we've progressed. This country has moved on. And what we need now in the 20th century is a more activist government led by an activist president who, needs not to be so cautious or careful about constitutional restraints or even restraints that have sort of occurred through practice over time. It's time to start with a clean slate, to infuse as much elements of energy that we can into the executive branch, especially to confront the problems of modernity. So it's a complete upending of the founder's conception of the presidency, which talks about the president as a unifier, which recognizes a kind of sense of limits around the presidency. TR and Woodrow Wilson's presidency is very open ended. It's basically whatever the president wishes to do that he believes in the national interest. And it extends all the way up through Richard Nixon and others.
Would you have said that a president like George Washington, I'm thinking about Nixon's famous remark when he's asked by David Frost, so if the president does it, that means it's not illegal. If the president is acting for the national security purposes, is that something that's a modern idea, or could we trace that as far back to someone like George Washington?
Well, Jeff, I would even argue that we can trace it back to some extent to the Federalist Papers. There's a reference by Hamilton and also by Madison in a separate essay. Madison talks about how the delegates at the Constitutional Convention may have exceeded their authority in terms of going beyond just tweaking or revising the Articles of Confederation and deciding to scrap the Articles altogether. He cites that as an example, perhaps, of the laws of necessity at work, overriding the written laws that the Confederation Congress had issued to its delegates. And Hamilton cites an example of what, as well, that you cannot completely, I think he uses the word chain down. He uses chains in there. You've got to give some flexibility to your elected leaders to respond to unforeseen crises. So I think this notion of what the fancy name for it is prerogative power. Uh, Hamilton seems to have believed in it. Seems that Madison perhaps as well in unique circumstances. And certainly Thomas Jefferson on more than one occasion defended this concept of the highest duty of the statesman being to protect the political order. The highest duty of a citizen might be obedience to the written law. That's not necessarily, according to Jefferson, the highest duty of an elected figure like an American president. So this notion of presidential emergency power has, I think, very deep American roots. It goes back to the thinking of John Locke and some others. Um, the problem was, I think, with Nixon's conception and even Kennedy and some of the other modern presidents, is again, they lost that sense of a wall of separation between what was good for them and what was good for the national interest. They became the national interest. That's a conception that I don't think a Hamilton, a Jefferson, or a Madison would have endorsed. So Nixon ends up using illegal measures against the anti-war movement and ultimately against the Democratic Party and justifies it in a sense on the grounds of national security and that if the president does it, it can't be illegal. That's not what Jefferson and Hamilton were talking about.
So a question that was that's been asked was, do these crises show, and this you mentioned prerogative power, which was thought to be a power of the king,
Right.
and a lot of Americans, of course, didn't want the president to be a king, even in times of crisis.
Yep.
That do these crises show that there's a flaw in our Constitution, or that the president needs to act when the law is silent, or as you said, sometimes even against the law? Or, as you said, is that really from the beginning part of our system so that maybe the president is a little bit more like a king than we wanted to admit?
Yeah, I think the latter comment is probably closer to the truth, again, within certain constraints. But I think most of the key founders would have acknowledged that it is impossible to write a written constitution that can foresee every potential threat and crisis coming down the road. It just can't be done. So there has to be some element of flexibility built into that system to protect that constitutional regime. Um, now, the and look, in Article 1, it does give Congress the power to suspend habeas corpus, right? So Lincoln, for instance, in the early days of the Civil War, assumes that power for himself for a period of 2 or 3 months or so before Congress comes back into session. And he defends that action on the grounds that was he supposed to stand by and let the entire American system disintegrate while waiting for members of Congress to return? That's an argument out of necessity, right? He's appealing to the laws of necessity, not to the Constitution, but he's saying that he was doing that in order to preserve the Constitution. He recognizes that the power to suspend habeas corpus lies in Article 1, therefore with Congress, not with him. But he tries to argue, and I admit this is kind of a stretch. Look, I knew once Congress came back into session, they would ratify my actions after the fact, which of course they did. Look, I'm not down. I mean, this is a scary doctrine, which is why it is so important for who it is we choose to hold that position of president, because ultimately it's their judgment about what constitutes a national emergency that we're going to all have to live with the consequences. So, Jefferson's check on this prerogative or emergency power was after the crisis passes, the head of state must tell the people, tell the citizenry why it is he engaged in this particular emergency measure, recognizing that under normal circumstances, it was against the written law, but he has to make a case for himself and throw himself on the court of public opinion. That was Jefferson's check on this remarkable power.
So, in particular, I think some folks may know this, but others would be surprised to hear that that's how America acquired Louisiana and the
Yeah,
Louisiana Territory. Could you just tell us? It's not one of the
right.
readings we had, but could you tell us that story because it's an interesting example of a kind of crisis that confronts Thomas Jefferson as president.
It certainly was a crisis for Jefferson. It certainly was a crisis for his party that, at least on the surface, seemed to have rejected the more energetic presidential model put forward by Hamilton and some other Federalists. So when Jefferson sees an opportunity to acquire this enormous territory in the Mississippi Valley region, from the Gulf of Mexico up to present day Canada, this is a tremendous national security boom for the United States. He's not going to allow us to miss this opportunity. The problem was that his philosophical principles would seem to indicate that the Congress needed to pass a constitutional amendment to acquire this territory, which I think would come close to doubling the size of the United States, if I'm not mistaken. He gets over his constitutional qualms when he gets word that, perhaps the French are going to pull out and Napoleon's changing his mind. He overcomes his constitutional scruples. Yes, I would say for Jefferson, this was an example of prerogative power at work. And by the way, a lot of members of his own party abandoned him at this point because they believe he did betray his principles in the Louisiana Purchase. I should note, by the way, Hamilton thought there was no problem at all with Jefferson engineering this acquisition, that this was part and parcel of Article 2 powers under the Constitution. And Hamilton noted the Constitution did recognize that new states would be eventually added to the American political order. So Jefferson's constitutional angst was a waste of time in Hamilton's view.
And this might be one time when Hamilton and Jefferson actually agreed.
I think that's right. One of the few. Well, the other time they agreed is they both wanted George Washington to run for a second term. So
Aha. Even after Jefferson had criticized him for some of those actions.
even after that, because Jefferson feared somebody worse, either John Adams or Alexander Hamilton. Better to have Washington.
In these various crises, we see that you use the word magnanimity. And a couple of folks have been asking, tell us a little bit more what you mean by that word, because it really seems to be so important in a crisis. It's not just what a president can do or not do in a crisis, but it's how they conduct themselves and how they think about and act in the crisis. So could you say a little bit more about this quality of what you're calling magnanimity?
Sure. I would describe it as a certain, and this is going to be a little bit vague, and I apologize for that, but a kind of greatness of soul, a willingness to not assume that you know everything, that there is a possibility that folks on the other side of you, even on the most contentious issue imaginable, slavery, for instance, might be motivated by uh, positive forces, that they're not necessarily evil people. And so it's an approach to politics. It's an approach to life where you avoid black and white extremes, where you try to put yourself in the feet of your adversaries. Again, Lincoln uh, never went after Jefferson Davis personally, never went after Robert E. Lee personally. Again, thought that we all worshiped the same God, we all read the same Bible. It's an unwillingness to quickly condemn, to make snap judgments, to make a caricature out of your political opponents. The problem with presidents, I think, who lack that sense of magnanimity is before a crisis comes, if they're constantly engaging in attack, 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 when the crisis comes, their credibility is already impaired. A significant number of their fellow citizens have already tuned them out. And there is a very practical benefit for a president recognizing that and trying to stay above that constant partisan din, that constant partisan battle. And by the way, a modern president, who I believe, relatively modern, in my conception, modern president who did that was Dwight Eisenhower. Eisenhower stayed above the fray, understood the importance of that head of state role, never personalized his conflicts with Lyndon Johnson, the majority leader, or other Democrats, Sam Rayburn. Um, Now he did have an attack dog in Richard Nixon as vice president, but he himself rejected the politics of personal destruction completely. Now, maybe as a famous general and a war hero, he could do that easier than a Nixon could or a Kennedy could. But that's the kind of quality I'm talking about. There was a kind of magnanimity, I think, in Eisenhower's soul as well. And the way he conducted himself for 8 years as president is the closest I think we have in modern times to that earlier founding conception of the president as as a unifying head of state, as somebody who appeals to our better angels.
Interesting. That's so interesting because it makes me wonder, in your opinion, you've studied presidents for so long and presidents in crisis. Do you think that we as citizens or historians are too quick to criticize presidents? I think you've even written a book on this with respect to the George W. Bush presidency. Um,
Yeah,
Rust to Judgment, if I'm not mistaken, is the
that's right.
title. Um, but because help us understand some of the challenges and the factors that presidents have to think through in responding to a crisis. Because it's easy to look back 50 years later and say, well, they should have done this, this, or this. But we're not living in that moment in that office with the situation that they themselves confronted, like Lincoln at the beginning of the Civil War, Washington with the Whiskey Rebellion, Kennedy with the Cuban Missile Crisis. It's easy to look back and criticize. But can you talk a little bit more about the factors that presidents have to worry about when they make decisions in a crisis?
Yeah, another terrific question, Jeff. Yeah, look, hindsight is always 2020, as you were just getting at. Um, Things do look very different from the Oval Office. Not that well, I guess I passed through there once as a tourist, but having worked on oral histories for every president from Ronald Reagan up through George W. Bush, excuse me, up through Barack Obama, um, I can tell you that whether we're talking Democrats or Republicans, most of those folks that we interviewed, uh, and I know this is going to sound naive to a lot of folks, most of those people were interviewed, and we're talking hundreds of Democrats, hundreds of Republicans, cabinet officers, vice presidents, secretaries of state, defense, etc. They actually do care about the national interest. I mean, there are other motives at work, of course, their own careers, their boss's career, boss's political prospects. But and of course, these people were putting their best foot forward for us. But I do believe they were patriots. They
Mhm.
believed in the United States of America. And I would go into an occasional interview and I'd have an impression that I had garnered from the media during my long life about Secretary of State X or Attorney General Y. And I'd come out of there after 2 days thinking, that's not the person I read about. That person actually did care about this country. That person actually did have a reason why he or she pursued policy X. There's much more to the story than we were initially told when the story itself was breaking. Um, uh, and in the Oval Office, that's accentuated 10, 20, 100-fold. So be leery of snap judgments, be leery. And this is one of the reasons I have a problem with a lot of social media where we all become experts. We all pounce on an issue without having the facts. I actually don't think you can make an honest assessment of an American presidency for interest until about 20 or 30 years has passed. One of the reasons I wrote that book on George W. Bush is that people were condemning his presidency before it was even over. And by people, I mean historians and political scientists. And my understanding of being a historian or a political scientist, you do research, you do interviews, you go through archives. You don't make snap judgments based on the headlines in the Washington Post. Too many of us in the scholarly world, I think, do that. I'm not arguing, and I did not argue in that book that George W. Bush was a great president, but I was arguing for a kind of sense of academic humility, a sense of restraint. Let's wait until we hear the whole story 20, 30 years down the road when information is declassified. So, sorry, long-winded answer. Things look very different from inside 1600 Pennsylvania Avenue. And I do have a kind of knee-jerk sympathy for anybody who holds that job.
Yeah. It's often been said that no easy decision reaches the president's desk.
Well put, Jeff. Absolutely true. Absolutely true.
And we have to think about some of the other things, and even from some of your books that I've read, we get a sense of, there are constraints at the time when a president acts, forces that push them one way or another that we don't have 30 years or 50 years later. Things like public opinion.
Yeah.
So, for example, people often want to raise a criticism of Abraham Lincoln. Why didn't he raise regiments of black troops in the Civil War earlier? Something that even abolitionist friends of his, like Frederick Douglass, criticized him for, but then later said, in a wonderful speech that I would recommend to everybody, Frederick Douglass's Oration in Memory of Abraham Lincoln, which was given in 1876. So 11 years after Lincoln is assassinated, and a little bit of time has gone by. And Frederick Douglass says, even on an issue like that, I see now that Lincoln had to worry about public opinion. What would people think if, for example, a regiment of black troops was actually in the Union Army fighting? That's not something they had to worry about 50 years after that, or 100 years, which now it seems like we should have done right away. But public opinion can constrain things. I always tell our students, you think you have all the information now, but presidents don't have all the information at the time they have to make snap decisions. Even with the vast intelligence operations that you've written about, still we don't know everything. And presidents even don't know everything they need to know in order to make a decision. They have to make a judgment. And they have to deal with Congress. They have to deal with the bureaucracy that again constrains what they can do. They don't know the effects of their actions exactly, and they have to think through those. Again, 30 years later, we can see what the effects were, and we can say, well, obviously that was going to be the effect. But you don't necessarily know that at the time. And I'm just wondering if those kind of constraints have led us to be sometimes too quick to be critical, and it perhaps raises the importance of the kind of history that you're doing and that we're studying to get a more historical perspective on presidents.
I think so, Jeff. That was very well put. You put it much better than I did. All these constraints that presidents operate under, the information constraints, the pressure of time, pressure from Congress, pressure from the media, um, extremely difficult job. And I do think a deeper understanding of history helps us as citizens uh, become more humble in our own judgments, perhaps of contemporary issues, avoid sweeping condemnation of political figures on either side of the fence, knowing that they're in these difficult positions. I have, as I said, tremendous sympathy for the person who has to occupy that office. And it's very important, it's incumbent on us when we make that choice every 4 years that we take this into consideration. We take these pressures into consideration. We look at the character of this individual who's going to make these sometimes life and death decisions. And an understanding of history is it's a tremendous plus in helping us to make those decisions. And again, your program and all the programs that Ashbrook sponsors is just, it's, as far as I'm concerned, this is one of the answers that's going to help this country move ahead in the 21st century by broadening people's historical horizons and showing them that we have done some things in the past that actually worked and might actually be worth trying to bring back.
One question from the audience as we're coming to a conclusion here is, give us one of your not necessarily your favorite president or president in time of crisis, but an action. We've looked at 5 or 6 presidents. You had us read from them. Uh, one of your favorite moments for a president in a crisis, and what that shows us.
Yeah. Uh, Terrific question. I'm running through a series of, I mean, look, this might be a mistake ending on this note, but I will defend till my last breath some of the actions that George W. Bush took in the days after 9/11. And I had you read a very brief collection of comments he made regarding the status of Islamic Americans in the United States. Bush may have gone over the top in terms of warrantless wiretapping and torture techniques, and you can have at him on that. Although I think even there's some arguments to be made in defense of some of those decisions. But when it came to the treatment of our fellow citizens who were Muslim, that president stepped up. And I don't think he's ever received his due for that. And I should point out that one of the criticisms of him that persists to this day, even within his own party and amongst some conservatives, is that he was too soft on Islam. They mock him for describing Islam as a religion of peace. Um, Again, he was under tremendous political pressure, tremendous public pressure to take some steps similar to what FDR did against Japanese Americans at the beginning of the Second World War. So one of the reasons I decided to write that book in defense of some of Bush's actions was what I see as a somewhat politically courageous stand to defend the civil liberties, civil rights of our fellow citizens who are Muslim.
Thank you, Steve. We're reaching the end of our time. What a fascinating conversation. Let me recommend to everyone again Steve's book, The Lost Soul of the American Presidency. It's a wonderful study. There are so many other resources out there. If you want to learn more about Ashbrook and what our programs and what we're doing, Steve mentioned some of them. Go to ashbrook.org. It gives you a sense of who we are as an independent educational center located here at Ashland University in Ashland, Ohio. Also, take a look at teachingamericanhistory.org, TAH.org. We have wonderful programs for teachers around the country that are doing yeoman's work in bringing that kind of historical understanding of American principles to teachers and to their students in the classroom. Educational resources online at tah.org. We're sort of all homeschoolers now. So if there's materials for your children, grandchildren, nieces and nephews, let me highly recommend for American History and Government, tah.org. It is a wonderful collection. It's the largest primary source historical collection in the United States. And it's been curated by scholars like Steve and others who have helped us put together these great collections. We have a core documents collection of volumes of primary historical documents in hard copy, but also online that can be downloaded for your use. They're collections of documents, and we even have a volume on the American presidency that includes primary sources and historical introductions and study questions so that you can read them at home with your children, with your grandchildren, and work through them. It's a great introduction to thinking seriously and deeply about America. So I want to just welcome you to avail yourselves of those resources. They're all free. They're all available there online at ashbrook.org and at tah.org. Our next webinar, our third in the series, we're going to be having a conversation with Dr. Steve Hayward on the economic consequences of national crisis. It's been in the news a lot these days. What about the Dow Jones? What about the economy? What actions should government take or not take in dealing with the economic effects of a national crisis? That's going to be our conversation next Wednesday, April 8th, again at 1 p.m. Don't forget the purpose of these webinars. We want to help you become more historically informed, as Steve was saying, get a deeper historical perspective that you can bring to bear on the current situation, and learn from the past. And we hope that that will help you renew your own understanding of American history and of the principles of this great country. And I think history shows that, as Steve was suggesting, we get through these crises as Americans. Some of our presidential leaders in times of crisis make great decisions. Some of them don't make great decisions. But the amazing fact is the American people and our constitutional order survives. It continues. It's a testimony to the grit and ingenuity of the American people, and I think to the vision and insight of our founders in setting up this constitutional order. So we hope that you'll renew those understanding and come away with a sense of hope uh, for this country and for our future. As always, just want to thank you again for being here with us. Stay healthy, stay hopeful, and stay connected with Ashbrook. Thanks again, and thank you, Steve.
Thank you, Jeff.